And we are back with another episode of Gladio for Europe. I am Russian Sam, joined as always by my excellent co-host Liam.
Hey, how are we today in this lovely sandy afternoon?
Well, not so good, as any follower of current events will know, because with the release of Denis Villeneuve's second installment of the Dune series, people are going balls to the wall crazy. It's total pandemonium out there. Yeah, the American people are seeing nightmarish visions of the devastating jihad that will kill billions. Zealots across the country are desertifying their lands to make them fertile terrain for the Shai Hulud, and the subterranean construction business is going through an unprecedented boom, as we saw back in January.
Yeah, that's true. There are a lot of tunnels right now.
Yeah, so there's no doubt in my mind, seeing all of this, that the descendants of those of us who survive are going to adopt a new calendar divided into BD and AD, that is after Dune, for nothing will ever be the same.
Right.
And in light of these very concerning developments, we decided that it would be useful to explore the Dune behind Dune. It's well known that Islamic and Arab influences, which have been unjustly scrubbed from the adaptation, played a very strong role in Herbert's world building, but it's really only the tip of the iceberg.
Right. So Dune, if you're not familiar, first read it, watch it. It's great. I love both the book and the film. No adaptation is perfect, and there's a lot that I think this film version could have done better, but it's so much fun, and I think it is, at the end of the day, a pretty fitting tribute to Herbert's work. Dune is a space opera, this epic fantasy story involving kingdoms and empires in the far future. In fact, it's actually one of the most far future works of science fiction I can think of. I believe it's set 20,000 years in the future.
Oh no, it's like 20,000 years in the future of the first colonies in space, which is like a couple of thousand years after our timeline.
Yeah, so it's even more, yeah. And so Dune was not the first space opera, but it was the first of that genre to really get major critical acclaim. I'm sure there are some interesting, works in that space before Dune, but this is really where things start to become much more thematically interesting. It is an inversion of the traditional heroic narrative, something that's especially clear in the second film, but it's built with all of the pieces to make an exciting page turner or blockbuster film. Like we said, it's set deep in the future, yet many elements of modern culture survive. And this, I think, is one of Herbert's most brilliant choices. It's really what sets Dune apart from so much other science fiction, especially because the elements of modern cultures present in the world of Dune are not predominantly Western. Like you mentioned, Russian Sam, some of the explicit Islamic influence is toned down in the feature version, but there's still a ton that seeps through, and it gives us so much to talk about. There are Islamic and Buddhist influences in many different cultures, as these traditions have become widespread across the Galactic Empire. There is also a version of Christianity recounted in something known as the Orange Catholic Bible, this strange synthesis of Catholicism and Protestantism, but it's so far in the future that any memory of Christ himself has vanished. And of course, these Islamic influences are most prominent among the wandering desert culture, the Fremen, the people of Arrakis, or as they call it, Dune.
Right, but before we continue, we would just like to remind our listeners that we are on Patreon, and given recent events and the difficulties of navigating this world, we're going to need to significantly up our spice production to maintain our mentat abilities and keep these pumping.
That's right. And I'm just going to say, Russian Sam, this episode is your baby. This is your planet, your Dune. You did a great job here with all of this research. I think this is a really fun sandbox to play in. All right, so we can't talk about Dune without getting into the life and thought of its author, Frank Herbert, an all-time weirdo. He is the type of guy you really rarely see these days, especially given the ways that social media and politicization has really kind of streamlined the kinds of views people tend to hold. We're saying this because he was deeply reactionary and conservative in some ways, while also holding many views that today would seem radically progressive. Views about colonialism, views about the environment, views about Native American rights. I know you described him, Russian Sam, as almost third worldist in his views towards imperial domination. And he created this potent melange of ideas, pardon the pun, which makes the Dune franchise really some of the most compelling fiction that of all science fiction. It's really just a great series. I will say I'm only halfway through the Frank Herbert books. I haven't finished the sextology yet, but man, I'm really loving what I've read so far, and I think that Villeneuve's adaptation, it really, really hits the spot.
Yeah, it's quite good, but I do have some problems with it. I feel like he made it much more personal than it is in the books in some ways, in that it's almost a morality tale where, you have this house, the Atreides, who are the upright people, led by Leto, the father, of course. And the way he's portrayed in the first one is, just sort of this kindly man who's going about walking into what he clearly sees is a trap, but he must nevertheless continue on this path because of duty and virtue and all of these things. But then when you actually look at the book, there's a much more murky picture of the Atreides themselves, which only becomes much more sinister as the books progress. And then suddenly you're reading Dune Messiah, and Paul is comparing himself favorably to Hitler. So and
they just announced that Dune Messiah is coming. A movie of Dune Messiah is now in the works, and I'm really curious if they keep the Hitler line. Something tells me they won't. But so I would push back on that. I think that the second film especially does a really good job of explaining that Paul Atreides is not in fact a hero, that he is co-opting this righteous struggle of the Fremen toward his own very evil ends. I guess the one thing that I would agree with maybe is that a mistake of the adaptation is that any evil in Paul's quest is shown to be the work of his mother, the Bene Gesserit. It's seen as this kind of result of these, centuries-long machinations that he is unable to stop. And I think that being unable to avoid prophecy is a very important theme in these books and these films. But I do think that by making Paul and his father a little bit too heroic, there are these kinds of there are strange gender implications there, and they're also it's a little bit it's more obvious storytelling. It's not as nuanced as the books portray them.
Yeah, it's one of the perils of making something for the mass market. Islamic influence is also very considerably toned down, which I understand on one level because
we'll get into that in a minute. We'll get into that later. But let's on the topic of houses and lineage, let's go into the strange pedigree of Frank Herbert himself. One thing I didn't realize was that he was Irish American, and interestingly, a distant relative of Joseph McCarthy. Supposedly, his family were related to the McCarthys of Blarney Castle, of the famous Blarney Stone. And interestingly, although he was a Republican, he was no fan of Joseph McCarthy. So this distant relation, apparently was not a matter of pride for the Herbert family. A lot of what we know about his family comes from his son, Brian Herbert, who both continued his father's novel series with mixed reviews there, and also wrote a biography called Dreamer of Dune, which it is an authorized biography. So, there's a lot that he doesn't leave in, but we still consulted this heavily for this episode. And there's a lot of interesting stuff in the family lore. I believe that
Oh, yeah. So here's the relevant passage. Henry VIII used to frequent a public house run by a woman named Moll Golden, a place where he drank and sang. Moll had 6 illegitimate children, all presumably fathered by Henry. She was an exceptional singer, and was said that she took the name Golden because of her voice. Henry had his own musical talents, as he sang with her and played the lute. He may even have written the tune Greensleeves for her. And that's very dubious, understandably. And the entire biography is kind of written like this, honestly, where you're kind of raising your eyebrow a bit. Like at one point he claims that his father had an IQ of 190. But it's a fun read for sure. If anything, it reminds you of the book written in the world of Dune by Princess Irulan about her husband Paul.
Oh yeah. And then Frank Herbert's other side of his family were Bavarians, and they emigrated to the United States in the 19th century. And interestingly, his grandfather was part of Eugene Debs' socialist democracy movement prior to his presidential campaigns. So he did have. So Frank Herbert, even though he was not a leftist in any sense, he did have this interesting, ancestral connection. It's easy to imagine he might have grown up hearing his grandfather say, things that would have been considered pretty red by the 30s and 40s. Like a lot of movements we've discussed on this podcast, Eugene Debs actually also, his followers established something known as the Burley Colony near Tacoma, Washington, which is pretty interesting. And Otto Herbert, the Bavarian grandfather in question, actually relocated his family for that reason to Burley. It's very interesting. And although the commune was short-lived, many families, including the Herberts, remained in this region. So Frank Herbert was born in 1920 to parents who eked out a modest but pretty comfortable petty bourgeois living as proprietors of a local general store and gas station, like a 7-Eleven family in modern times, with also some interest in a local logging business. But as capitalism developed across the Pacific Northwest, it became harder to make a living as a small proprietor. Frank Herbert's father, Frank Sr., had tried his hand at operating a bus line, but that business failed, and he tried to make a new living as a salesman before eventually becoming a Washington State patrolman. The young Frank would spend much of his youth on the family farm, where he had plenty of time to read, and it seems like he was writing stories from basically as early as he could hold a pen. I think his first documented writings come from when he was 8.
Yeah, and the family flirted with success, but it was never able to achieve it. Herbert's father left a patrolman job in 1931 to become a co-founder of a dance hall and a speakeasy known as the Spanish Castle, but his parents left the venture the following year because they felt that their partners were cheating them, and to their chagrin, the castle suddenly became wildly successful for decades to come, and the Herberts were left out to dry.
Oh, man.
So the family would struggle through the Depression. The young Frank, who was an avid fisherman and hunter from a young age, would have to keep his family fed. While doing this, one day he came across a man who would deeply influence him. He was called Indian Henry by Herbert's son of the whole band Salish. According to the recollections of Brian, he semi-adopted Herbert and taught him much about foraging and fishing. This was a man from the nation known as the Quileute, who are actually quite famous in American pop culture because if there are any Twilight readers in the audience, you'll know that the Native Americans there are also Quileute, who are, these...
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's very funny.
Yeah, and this particular angle is explored by Daniel Immerwahr in his article, Quileute Dune, Frank Herbert, Indigeneity and Empire. He talks about how this encounter with Indian Henry might have shaped the young Herbert. Immerwahr's research led him to discover that there was indeed a man in the region named Henry Martin. The Quileute people had long-standing disputes with white loggers in the region, and the community struggled because of this. Martin himself ran into trouble with the law in 1927 when he was arrested for allegedly trafficking alcohol by an agent whom the federal government sent, who served as both the police officer and the judge of the community. So this same officer sentenced him to 60 days of hard labor. Martin's lawyer told him that being arrested and sentenced by the same man was patently illegal, and so Martin went on the lam. He had vaguely alluded to his troubles with the law to the young Herbert, but it's really unclear what Herbert actually knew. Nevertheless, this was clearly a very profound relationship for Herbert, who sort of adopted this idea of an outsider learning native ways, a trope that he would return to time and time again, not just in Dune, but in all of his major works. Most importantly for our purposes, Paul and the Fremen.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this later, but yeah, there's been a lot of controversy, and I think it's an interesting point of debate, basically, of to what extent is Paul Atreides, a classic white savior. That's a phrase that's come up a lot, I think, in like 2020s, 2010s pop culture writing, and I think that it's a very complicated situation with the novel Dune, but they're also not totally beating the allegations.
Yeah, so just to give you guys an idea of how woke Herbert was, for lack of a better term, quoting from the Quileute Dune article, in Soulcatcher, which was Herbert's only non-sci-fi novel, it took seeds at the whites who stole his people's lands and raped his sister. We don't know if Martin spoke that way to Herbert, but Herbert came to view settler colonialism critically. As a newspaperman in Santa Rosa, Herbert used a review of a Jimmy Stewart Western to indict the federal government for, quote, having violated the humane provisions of the Genocide Convention by acts against more than Indian nations. Quote, we used whiskey, broken promises, class distinctions, lies, subterfuge, indirection, half-truths, and more whiskey, he wrote. Herbert particularly noted the, quote, avaricious and conscienceless whites, including the Army and the Indian Service, who had burned Indian homes and killed their babies. So, yeah, this is definitely not something a normal white man would have been talking about in the early 50s at all.
Yeah, and I gotta mention, I'm like 95% sure that the unnamed Jimmy Stewart Western is Broken Arrow, which involves the story of Geronimo and Cochise, the Apache rebels, who initially had a favorable relationship with the settlers, but then resorted to violence when things broke down.
Yeah, so Herbert, he was always tied to this Quileute people, even though his relationship with Indian Henry ceased after a couple of years. Some years later, he would come into contact with another man who also grew up on the Quileute reservation. He was named Howard Hansen, or Howie, and this was someone who also had a very ecological bent to his work. He wrote his memoirs and recollections of his time on the reservation all the way back in the 50s or early 60s, which Herbert read at the time. And this had a really heavy influence on his thinking, in particular ecology, and the descriptions of the ways in which all of these settlers were coming in primarily for the logging business and despoiling the landscape and leaving the local native peoples totally dependent on them for basic provisions, because they were being stripped of their woodlands and their access to resources and sort of strung along into white society in this very peripheral and dependent relationship.
Yeah, no, it's a continuation of what we saw in our episodes on colonial New England. It's the same kind of ways that, dependency can very easily lead to elimination.
Yeah. And this was clearly something that Herbert was very conscious of. We just see this theme crop up again and again, even within the first novel, this idea of this sort of despotism of forcing the Fremen into, well, keeping Arrakis in general in this desertified state to keep mining the spice rather than allowing the Fremen to terraform the planet and to, live in better conditions. It's just...
Well, let's go deeper into this character of Howie himself, because he seems to have been a pretty important influence.
These were topics that Hansen would have with the Herberts regularly. Again, he was the godfather of Brian Herbert, and he was clearly an influence on their lives. He would remain around the reservation and would just, if not physically, then at least in spirit, and he would continue to go back fairly regularly and tell the Howards about what was going on. So
the Herberts, you mean?
Yeah, and Brian Herbert talks about one return that Hansen made and how that affected him. Quote, "When he visited us at Brown's Point, he had with him a book titled Ecology, which had been loaned to him by an Indian friend. The book spoke of the ecological decimation of the planet Earth and how we combined this knowledge with what he had seen in Glapush, that is the Quileute reservation. In a conversation with Dad, Howie told me, he said angrily, quote, 'They're going to turn this whole planet into a wasteland, just like North Africa.' 'Yeah,' Frank Herbert responded, 'like a big dune.'" And that's presumably the
there it is,
the origin of the title of it's like when they say the title of a movie within a movie, it's like that's when you know it's going to get real.
Yeah. Yeah. Another pretty good quote from this guy, Howie, from Brian Herbert, is that he claimed to have said, "The earth is dying. It is being misused by non-Indian civilizations that take and do not give." And this is a theme that is going to be very important to the books of Dune. And it's also a theme that seems very progressive today. But as we're going to explain, despite this opposition to colonialism and imperialism, Herbert was not really any kind of a leftist. And I don't think he saw these views as being particularly progressive. If anything, he saw them as kind of calling for a return to the distant past. And I think that the fact that he was a great writer while also being quite reactionary is also pretty interesting. A lot of people in progressive circles, I think, make the mistake of saying that there is no such thing as good right-wing art. I think that isn't true. I think that many right-wingers are able to produce very good pieces of art. It's just that so many right-wingers just get so caught up in either, cheerleading the systems of power that they can't really think of how to write something interesting.
Or they're just too busy making up guys to get mad at.
Or that, yeah. But once in a while, a real freak like Frank Herbert comes along and does something no one's done before. So in and for example, there's a great article written by the writer Haris Durrani entitled "Frank Herbert, The Republican Salafist, where he explains that, quote, while anthropologists look to primitives as abstract models for 20th century property theory, Herbert saw them as influences on American culture. One might read this into the ways that non-Western traditions saturate his future beyond the Fremen. More significantly, Herbert drew different lessons from non-Western traditions. Economists, ecologists, and lawyers found in these so-called primitives their legal liberalism. Their practices employed abstracted rules and institution-like social organization that increased the efficiency of resource management. These scholars extracted what Herbert dubbed ethical law, which holds that, quote, I, the thinking animal, see the logical consequences of these moral actions are such and so, and maybe I'd be better to modify the moral law slightly by a higher ethical law. By contrast, Herbert regarded ethical law as the domain of unconscious myth-making. And just to aside here, myths and their effect on human behavior is a huge theme on Dune. So in contrast to all of this, Herbert saw non-Western traditions as positive sources of more complex social practices. In part, Herbert understood non-Western societies as sites where ethics were overcome by religion, necessity, or the limits of moral life, something that is imposed on people by their environment. And although this characterization might invoke the romantic ecological Indian, Herbert seemed to believe that moral rules, if out of sync with environmental change, could upset ecological harmony. In fact, he claimed to explicitly reject romanticization. Many people think that the Indians were the best ecologists this land has ever seen. I don't think that's necessarily true. Some Native American cultures were actually quite hard on their environments. They were just slower because their population was small, slower at causing damage than the whites were. And again, this is from Harry Stirani's Frank Herbert, The Republican Salafist. And keep the title in your mind because we're coming back to it.
Returning back to Frank Herbert's biography, in 1949, him and his wife moved to San Francisco, which was at that point a hotspot for America's budding counterculture. It was sort of the 60s before the 60s. Friends and neighbors would introduce him to Freud, Jung, Buddhism, and psilocybin mushrooms. While working a day job as a staffer for Senator Guy Gordon, it was during this period that Herbert began to write on the side professionally. He got some acclaim, but little attention for the short stories that he published in pulp magazines. And he wrote one novel in this period, The Dragon in the Sea, it was called, which warned about oil overconsumption. By the end of the 50s, just as he was getting ready to transition to fiction full-time, he returned to the Northwest to write a magazine article on a unique geological formation, the so-called Oregon Dunes, which were a 30,000-acre expanse of sand. Inspired by this trip, Frank Herbert got to work on Dune. After 3 years of research and planning, he began to publish the epic story of the Fremen and Paul Atreides in serialized form. In 1965, he expanded this into a full novel, which for whatever reason was only published by a mechanical publishing house.
And I believe they're mostly
they were publishing car manuals, but for whatever reason, they decided...
what I've heard, it was mostly known for publishing tractor manuals.
Right. So despite having some difficulty in finding a publisher, this novel would explode into the sci-fi world and received immediate acclaim. It became a favorite of the counterculture scene almost immediately. The burgeoning hippie movement, who were already enormous fans of J.R.R. Tolkien, took up Herbert. Yeah. It should be noted that despite the similarity in tone and large fan overlap between their books, Tolkien actually hated Dune. He never explained why, but if we had to guess, it would just be that it's too cynical. After all, these power plays and everyone is just not thinking about morality as much as their self-interest and the actual demands of power.
If I could jump in here, I think it's that in Dune, there is no Aragorn, and that every hero then is Isildur, who's the guy, if you remember, who vanquishes the Dark Lord Sauron, but then cannot bring himself to cast his ring into the fires of Mount Doom, And I think that actually this is something that a lot of later space opera that's derivative from Dune misses. And I think that, stuff like Star Wars and many other, lesser works of fiction, I'd say, and no offense to any Star Wars fans out there, is basically an attempt to use the tool set given to the science fiction community by Brian Herbert, but try to kind of put the toothpaste of moral ambiguity back into the tube.
Right. Like, honestly, in some ways, Frank Herbert is very dialectical, if we want to say the term, and very understanding of the material conditions that drive pretty much every interaction. So yeah, it's very interesting to think about that in the context of his politics, as well as, the way that a lot of sci-fi just doesn't want to engage with.
Another book that's brought up constantly as an influence on Herbert is Foundation. Have you read that?
No, I haven't. I'm not really into sci-fi, honestly.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan, and it's really dry, but people love it. It's a 1940s novel by Asimov that's all about kind of using like a longue durée vision of history to look at a far future science fiction world. But the difference between Foundation and I would argue, unfortunately, where Foundation kind of fails and Dune succeeds is that Dune actually has a plot. So, that Herbert took these really interesting ideas that had already been explored by science fiction writers like Asimov, that incorporated them into the kind of sort of heroic narrative mostly seen in kind of cheap, pulp sci-fi, but then had this really interesting perspective on morality and destiny and, human nature, I guess, that really turns this heroic narrative on its head. We don't have time to summarize the plot of the Dune book and its sequels here, but you can see the movies if you haven't read them. But I think that the main thing, the reason why I think that the story of Dune is somewhat radical is that although Paul initially appears to be this classic heroic savior, this Luke Skywalker, we quickly find out that he is co-opting this righteous struggle of the Fremen against colonialism for his own aims. And although he does have this genuine love for the Fremen, especially his lover and wife Chani, who's of the Fremen nation, he ultimately is using them. He is oppressing them in a strange way. He has, in a sense, become Dune's conqueror, and he's forced the Fremen to be his foot soldiers. So, and with all of that being said, I think let's jump into what this episode's really about, which are the themes and influences that make up Dune.
Technology is obviously a very big theme. After all, you have the whole Butlerian jihad thing going on.
Yes.
But while doing research for this episode, I actually looked into where exactly it comes from. And in the novels, it's based on this scientist who becomes a head in a jar basically and continues to do research, whose name is Butler. But the name itself, it comes from this 19th century writer named Samuel Butler, who was a critic of Darwin in his time. He believed in evolution, but he criticized natural selection as Darwin conceived of it. But he also dabbled in very early science fiction. So in the 1870s, he wrote this early sci-fi novel called Erewhon, where he talks about the so-called Darwin among the machines, where he describes a society where, the machines, they become progressively more advanced to the point where they are sort of replacing human labor.
Right.
They're acting autonomously. They are reproducing by themselves. And ultimately, this society decides that these machines need to be destroyed because they are destroying humanity. And clearly, this was a major influence on Herbert's thinking because the Butlerian jihad in the Dune universe, it happens along very similar lines where we have advanced computerized civilization, but ultimately people get fed up with it and they realize that they are having their humanity stripped of them by their dependence on all of this technology. So there's that famous book from the Orange Catholic Bible, "Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of man."
Yeah.
They fight this 1,000-year-long galactic struggle against the machines until finally they are wiped out. And in the Dune universe, we have a lot of technology, but it's not computerized in the same way.
Yeah, and it ties in very nicely with the world here because it's that instead of having computers, you have people with these psychic abilities. You have the guild navigators who can chart courses through space with powers of prescience. And then you have the mentats who are able to store, encyclopedias information in their heads. They act as human calculators, a human Wikipedia, but all of these people are powered by the magical spice melange, which is only found on the planet Dune or Arrakis. I think that also the kind of anxiety over the powers of computers, I think it's very important to note that this guy, Frank Herbert, was living in San Francisco in the 50s. He saw basically the birth of Silicon Valley as we know it. I would not be surprised if he knew people who worked at companies like IBM at this period. I know that IBM in particular, they had a famous phrase, which was that a computer must never make a management decision because a computer can never be held accountable. And I kind of wonder if, he might have heard that ethos from somebody working in the early computer sector when he, was coming up with this book.
Like, absolutely. I'm just kind of frightened of his prescience, frankly, because I was reading this one particular interview where he talks about the consequences of technology and what it's going to do to humanity long term. And I think it's worth reading from. Liam, you want to do you want to be Plowboy or Herbert?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. I'll be Plowboy. And for the record here, you heard that right. This is an article from the obscure early 1980s environmental magazine. Yes, it is unfortunately called Plowboy. All right. For the past few decades, power seems to have been getting more and more concentrated in big business and central authority. We've clearly been moving in the opposite direction from what you'd prefer. This is a Plowboy speaking to Frank Herbert.
I don't think that has to continue. I feel that as communication systems improve, and with the new computers that are continuously being developed, communications are coming on like gangbusters, people won't be so dependent on the often one-sided reporting of the conventional media for their information. Folks will see that we can take control of some social functions now handled by big government, schools, taxation, whatever, and that the bigger and stronger is always more effective idea is a phony bill of goods. So I see the evolutionary movement toward a certain kind of fragmentation, and not just because of improvements in communication.
What other factors do you think will influence this decentralization?
We've opened up the Pandora's box of violent technology. We're fast approaching a time when one person can make and employ instruments of violence equal to ones formerly reserved only to massive governments. And then he just goes on to expound upon his idea of the techno-peasantry, which is using technology within the bounds of social relations in a way that you can intimately understand and make sense of personally. But yeah, I mean, right now we're living in a time when AI-powered drone swarms, for example, are becoming a reality. So we could, in the next couple of years, very conceivably imagine a scenario where someone decides to do a mass shooting with these kinds of things, so to speak, and just so total destruction. It just...
I think we should note, though, that I'm not sure that he was necessarily saying this would be a bad thing. Given, his views as a libertarian and his views on authority, I think that he might have also believed that, proliferation of weapons technology, like 3D printed guns, for instance, you're seeing now, he might have seen that as a positive development that would have kind of leveled the playing field of power and allowed individuals to overthrow their government. And, it seems like in his heart, Herbert basically believed every government did deserve to be overthrown.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely ambivalent. Like, ambivalence is clearly something that's persistent in the thought of Herbert and the Dune universe itself.
Yeah.
But, I mean, the actual process of getting there, he understands it's going to be built on mountains of skeletons, basically. This devolution that's coming.
If we want to continue on the point of Herbert and violence, he had this very different approach toward global conflicts that you would see very different from most other libertarians. I think because most libertarians you encounter these days, especially on social media, they've been so captured by the kind of ideological movement of the right that they tend to be quite racist, to be frank, and they have very little sympathy for any kinds of non-Western anti-colonial movements. Herbert was the complete opposite, because not only did he have this kind of moral and emotional empathy for colonized peoples, I think he really loved seeing any kind of underdog take up arms against power. One thing I had no idea about until we started researching this episode, or you did, Rush Sam, this is all you, was that even though the Fremen heroes of Dune are clearly most inspired by Arab Muslim cultures, they actually have a lot of direct influence from a more obscure place, particularly in the American imagination. That being the North Caucasus, the Russian region of Dagestan, which I found really surprising.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because as it turns out, one of Herbert's main avenues for understanding Islam came through a book about the 19th century Caucasus and the struggle against the encroachment of the Russian Empire. It's called Sabers of Paradise. It was written by Leslie Branch, and it's mostly an account of the career of Imam Shamil, who was this sort of revolutionary figure who was both reviled and held up on a pedestal by Russian culture in a very strange way.
Yeah. I think that he's, arguably comparable with Geronimo or Tecumseh, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So Shamil Hughes, the so-called Lion of Dagestan, he spent 40 years fighting his jihad against the Tsar. That would ultimately come to naught. He would ultimately become a prisoner of the Tsar, but he was respected enough that he was basically kept in a golden cage. He had nice palaces, and he was allowed to go back to the Caucasus in his old age, I believe. But although the Fremen seem to hew much more closely to the stereotypical image of Arab Bedouins, like in Lawrence of Arabia, Herbert seems to mostly base the Fremen way of life on the Avars. There's also some influence seen in Paul Atreides' own culture as well, with the Atreides of Caladan having influences of all of these Caucasian peoples.
The most obvious of these is the extinct Caucasian language Chakabsa, which survived as a secret second language among the Avars that they would use as a code when hunting or going to war. And although this isn't made present in the film, the Fremen too have a secret language called Chakobsa. The funny thing is, actually, Herbert was never able to find any actual phrase book of this, hidden Caucasian language. So instead, he just tosses in words from Arabic, from Russian, and I think also from Serbo-Croatian, strangely, into this, Fremen speech used in the books. The Atreides family also have their own secret battle language, which I'm sure has to also be an influence from this book about the Avars of the Caucasus. And interestingly, he even borrowed some other words from other languages. The closest thing to a capital that the Fremen have is the underground settlement Siich Tabar. And I had no idea, but both of those two words there are actually taken from the Cossacks. They're borrowed from two old Slavic words. And so I think some of this is just kind of you can chalk it up to lazy world building. He just sees a word that looks cool and throws it in there. But I also think that he was going for something, which was that so far in the future, many influences from our own time survive, but they're not immediately recognizable. And often these influences mix together in funny ways. You see things that you wouldn't expect to see. A lot of people have made fun of the name Duncan, Idaho. I think that's awesome. There's no reason why that kind of place name cannot survive and become a normal last name 20,000 years from now. I think that's cool. I think if anything, the only problem with this kind of view of world building is not that this future world is too far removed from Earth. It's that I'm not sure that in 20,000 years there would be any identifiable influences, because that's just such a long period of time. But okay, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's just talk about the primary influence that's relevant to us here, which is of course Islam, because the Avars are a predominantly Muslim people, and that from what I understand, the battles by Imam Shamil probably would have been understood in the context of an Islamic holy war, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a jihad. Well, a series of jihads.
And we should mention that, as far as I can tell, that word is not used at all in the film adaptation.
I kind of understand them, because on the one hand, if they did include it, then there would be a lot of complaining about cultural appropriation, or they're framing Muslims as violent, which is very annoying.
Right, and you'd even have right-wingers saying that it was Muslim propaganda.
Yeah, and that too. And then on the other hand, it would just, cause a headache from a marketing perspective, because it's just a little too close to home.
Yeah, but I think that unfortunately this means that it is a very difficult book to adapt, and it's probably impossible to adapt the specifically Muslim influences without offending somebody. I think that Villeneuve could have done a much better job incorporating Arabic and Muslim elements. What's there is kind of mostly present in the form of generic stereotypes of desert peoples. They never mention in the films that these people actually are literally descended from Muslims. Although in this, twisted future world, they are specifically descended from Muslims who are also Buddhist. And the Fremen actually follow a religion known as Zen Sunni, which I think is kind of funny. I'm actually not sure how much Frank Herbert knew or read about Islamic religion itself, but he certainly saw Islam as this inspiring social movement, which at the time of his writing was influencing a lot of interesting changes in distant parts of the world.
Right. And in particular, when Frank Herbert was writing this in the early 60s, his eyes would have been on Algeria in particular. because the Algerian struggle for independence, it had been a fierce war for almost a decade at that point, when the Algerians were finally able to secure their independence from France in 1962. And this was something that was covered in the newspapers very prolifically. It was sort of the decolonial struggle of the time.
Yeah.
And the Algerian revolutionaries themselves, they had very complicated relationship with Islam, putting it mildly, although some of the leaders weren't really religious. The war, nevertheless, was the West's first exposure to a conflict draped in Muslim vocabulary.
Yeah.
So the Algerians' rallying cry of "Long live the martyrs" appears in Dune in the untranslated Arabic of the Ya Shuhada. But that's absent in the movie.
And again, I think this is something that was probably, meant to avoid appropriation complaints, but instead led to, I think, all just as understandable complaints about erasure. Like, how come, the one science fiction movie that actually involves heavy Islamic influence erases those influences? And, unfortunately, this is actually what Herbert's publishers initially wanted, because they were really confused and somewhat uncomfortable with the amount of Islamic influence in this future society. I think we should mention, though, that, in this time, 1963, I think most Americans only had a very vague idea about Islam. This was before the War on Terror, and this was even before the Nation of Islam, really started scaring white Americans in the later 60s. So this would have been somewhat perplexing.
Oh, but Liam, this was a time when another prominent depiction of Islam appeared on the silver screen.
Yeah.
That being Lawrence of Arabia. This was something that Herbert would have watched. He read the books. And clearly, Paul is meant to be modeled on T.H. Lawrence to some degree.
Totally, yeah. And I think that, we mentioned the concept of a white savior. I think that T.H. Lawrence also is kind of, or T.E. Lawrence, I believe, is also kind of a very nuanced figure, because although I think that fans of the film remember him as this heroic savior of the Arabs, I think the film itself paints a much more complicated picture. Just like Paul or Frank Herbert, he was a really weird guy who had very romantic ideas about Muslims, but also took advantage of a Muslim conflict for his own or his, empire's goals. And I wonder if, some of the kind of political moral ambiguity of the Fremen Jihad and the way it's exploited by Paul, if that's kind of based on Herbert's own reading of T.E. Lawrence's role in Arab history.
Yeah, it definitely is. Just he has a lot of diatribes against heroes in particular, and he just keeps going back in his various interviews to the idea of you have to be an independent person, you have to think for yourself, you don't want some hero to come and save you because you're on your own, and heroes will only lead you to destruction.
Yeah. And I think that, that one of the things that the film does best is really doubling down on the ways that Paul is not heroic. They really make it clear that he is part of this devious scheme by the Bene Gesserit order of witches/nuns who have their own selfish goals for using the Fremen. And eventually, he sees this prophecy that he believes is unavoidable, where he must not only liberate the planet Dune, he must turn these Fremen into his soldiers in his own jihad to establish his own galactic order, something just as evil as the one that he is fighting against. There's really no moral calculus. It's just that, he believes the prophecy tells him he must become this great, glorious conqueror, even if it comes at the death of, I think it's 60 billion people, you find out in the sequel.
60 billion, I believe, yeah.
And that, that's all that hasn't happened by the end of this film. But one interesting change, which I liked, was that Chani, who's Paul's lover, wife, lady, played by Zendaya, she has a bigger role in the film, and a much more nuanced role, because she is shown as the opponent of Paul in, taking leadership of the Fremen, but also an opponent of the religious Fremen who believe in these prophecies. I don't think she fully understands that these prophecies are fake and have been, laid there by the Bene Gesserit, including Paul's mother, Jessica. But she is skeptical of, this idea that religious fervor should determine politics. And I think that is kind of a very interesting change, especially because in so many real life anti-colonial struggles, you do see these conflicts between secular forces and religious forces. It's a very kind of interesting echo of Iran or, of course, Algeria.
Yeah.
So let's pivot now to talking about the Bene Gesserit, because they're one of my favorite parts of the book series. They're just bizarre characters. I really can't think of any good analog for these people in fiction. If you haven't read the books, but you've somehow still listened to, 45 minutes of this podcast, the Bene Gesserit are this all-female order of nuns, but they've got one very important distinction from Catholic nuns. Can you guess what that is, Sam, what I'm thinking of?
They do eugenics.
Yes, well, specifically,
and they reproduce.
They have lots of sex. They are they are not necessarily for like vicious reasons, but they are seen as like ideal queens and consorts because they have this great understanding of genetics, and they are assigned to marry powerful men to further these genetic lineages. And a big plot point in the books, and that's in the film of Dune, is that she was ordered, Jessica, Paul's mother, was ordered by the Bene Gesserit order to give birth to a daughter, but instead she used her great genetic powers and ascetic control of her own body to instead give Paul's father a son, the son and heir that he wanted. And I think that if you look at the ways that women are depicted in Dune, characters like Lady Jessica, like Princess Irulan, like the Reverend Mother Gohaim, they're all very well rounded. They're very intelligent, very capable in ways that are you wouldn't necessarily expect for a book written by a conservative, especially in the 60s. But at the same time, I think it's interesting that basically every named woman except for Chani is a member of the Bene Gesserit order. And I think that the ways that the Bene Gesserit order are, scheming and sexual doesn't exactly go against prevailing stereotypes. It just paints these gender stereotypes in a very different light.
Yeah, I love what your girlfriend said about the Bene Gesserit.
Yeah, I know. I feel bad bringing this up, but yeah, she thought that that I think we should. Yeah, the depiction of them, it's like it's not exactly sexist, but it almost feels anti-Semitic. Because they're this like secret scheming order, which does unfortunately look a little bit like anti-Semitic beliefs about Jewish people secretly pulling the strings behind world history. Because the world of Dune kind of presents a world in which these kind of centuries-long conspiracies are actually true, because the Bene Gesserit order have in fact been plotting behind the scenes to determine world politics and advance their own interests for centuries. And I don't think that kind of plot point is inherently reactionary. But I will say, if you ever heard of something called The Iron Dream, I think that author was onto something. Yeah,
well, I mean, just to reassure our audience that this isn't Herbert doing an anti-Semitism. This is clearly Herbert doing an anti-Jesuit thing because, I mean...
yes.
Jesuit, first of all, it just sounds a lot like Jesuit. And second of all, Brian Herbert, in his biography of his father, talks about how he had a lot of nuns in the family growing up, and they were very stern and strong women, like, the stereotype where they're kind of a pain in the ass to deal with, but they will set you on the right way.
Yeah, they whack you with rulers. In a way, it's kind of two feared female archetypes, because you have like the cruel nun school teacher who's very intelligent in a lot, presumably, she knows so much about the world, but also she's very punishing. She has her strong agenda. And then you have, the kind of the sexualized archetypes of the wife or the mother or the whore. And every Bene Gesserit woman we see basically fits into one of those archetypes. I think that as far as I can tell, every Bene Gesserit has some kind of sexual role in the story of Dune. And even though I think that Dune is it's a very sexless franchise, there's very little romance, there's no sensuality. There are a lot of very kind of cold mentions of sex, almost always involving a Bene Gesserit who is having sex for some kind of ulterior motive.
I think it should also be noted that in case it seems like we're giving Frank Herbert short shrift, he was very much a woman respecter in his personal life. He had a lot of great things to say about his wife. He was constantly thanking her for the sacrifices that she made, working jobs and whatnot, so Herbert could write, and giving him all these ideas that he was credited.
Yeah, she was the breadwinner for a while in their family.
Yeah, so again, just very unconventional conservative, this guy. I just love thinking about him.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us to kind of the closing section of this episode, which is the politics of Dune, which we've been hinting at this whole time. Because, we mentioned earlier that Frank Herbert was a Republican, which I think is very difficult for a lot of modern fans to wrap their heads around, especially because he has such a profound respect for Islamic cultures, for Native Americans, a great animosity toward the destruction of the environment, toward the oppression of Native Americans, and also, like we said, of course, he had a great admiration for many women. And all of that seems really orthogonal to the kinds of, vulgar, orcish conservatism you see in America, especially on social media these days. All of that is coded as wokeness.
Yeah, with one exception, Liam. I have to say that Herbert exemplifies the sort of conservatism that you saw with Clive Bundy, if you guys remember the 2014 Clive Bundy standoff where...
Oh, yeah, because he was an anti-government libertarian who was also pro-Black Lives Matter, because he saw the ways that Black Lives Matter protesters were against the police. Yeah, that's actually that's a good comparison.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let's talk about Herbert's conservatism, because it's very surprising in some ways, but he was a pretty staunch conservative. He was a libertarian. He was very anti-big government, hated taxes. He was also somewhat socially conservative, despite his seemingly progressive attitudes on race and gender.
And drugs.
He was a strong believer in and of course drugs, yeah. He was a strong believer in the importance of the family, and he thought that the increasing encroachment of the government including through, any kind of charitable or, social democratic endeavor would both reduce the power of the family and also reduce the power of the individual. I think it's important to mention that, the world of Dune is deeply traditional in a way that I guess some right-wingers could potentially admire. And you could argue it's actually it's a world more concerned with tradition than the modern world we live in today. And if anything, it seems to be the vision projected by a writer who feels deeply dissatisfied with the modern world. Because, the galactic empire that we see is ruled by a hereditary monarch, the Padishah, with a feudal hierarchy of dukes and barons beneath him. And then, of course, because energy shield technology blocks fast-moving projectiles, all combat has resorted to one-on-one sword fights, like it's the 15th century again. Mm-hmm. I think that, we mentioned already the Butlerian Jihad banning robots and computers, which means religion and superstition have now become much more important tools of the various factions of the galaxy. I'm also going to note that in this world, there's very little bureaucracy or meritocracy as we understand it. Very few people kind of rise up the ranks on their own merits. Instead, it seems like nearly every character in this book is born into some kind of position. Either they are an aristocrat, born to this birthright, or they are some kind of genetic superhuman who has some kind of psychic abilities crafted by centuries of straight up eugenics. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think that if there's anything you can really maybe, condemn in this book, which I really don't think is, worth doing. I don't think that, I don't think bad politics means something is a bad work of fiction. But I guess if there's anything that's really iffy, I think it's that Herbert completely takes the genetic engineering stuff at face value. These characters are hyper competent due to their, perfect centuries of breeding. And I'm pretty sure that, if Herbert had his way, he would have attempted some kind of breeding project like that in the modern world. I'm sure if he could.
I mean, the impression I get is that he believed that it worked, but he thought it was bad because, again, it's all part of this massive conspiracy that's happening on a multi-generational scale. That's something that the novels generally condemn. So it's like, yeah, it's real, but I don't know if we should be dabbling with this stuff.
Yeah, no, that could be it. And then, and I guess you should say also that, even if this the eugenics is portrayed somewhat neutrally, it has a terrible ramification on many of the people who experience it, because, Paul basically is doomed by his genetic perfection, if you want to call it that, to be this genocidal conqueror. He doesn't want to, but because of his unique genetic superpowers, he feels like he must. And his powers of prophecy caused by his genetics tell him that he must.
Yeah, and he's always in this bind, especially in the second book, because he knows what he has to do, what his destiny is, for lack of a better word, but he keeps fighting against it because it's just too monstrous for him to actually contemplate it. So he has to leave all that stuff to his son, who becomes a worm god, basically. But
to really get into the sequels, the books get weirder and weirder with each sequel, and that's why Dune is so fun. Keep going with the politics here. A big part of Frank Herbert's love for anti-colonial movements really just comes out of his view that all government authority basically is deserving of derision, and that whether you're a Muslim Algerian revolutionary fighting colonialism or a American Clive and Bundy type, taking up arms against the people who rule you is justified. And that's what you were talking about, how there are very few heroes in the Dune books, but the struggle of the Fremen people is portrayed as basically unambiguously heroic, and that the tragedy is that it's co-opted to go beyond the planet of Dune to conquer other planets abroad. To the victims become the oppressors. I think that also, and this is kind of why we mentioned that article describing Frank Herbert as a Republican Salafist, and it's entirely because he was an American conservative who, instead of embracing the imperialism and the white supremacy of many other conservatives of the 1960s, he instead had this very ecumenical attitude toward liberty. And he eagerly saw anybody who took up arms against oppression as, members of his own tribe.
Yeah, he was just very into the whole localist thing, where basically it should just be your family and your immediate surroundings. And those are the people who get to decide your life. He has a great quote. I don't think there's a bit of fucking difference between a bureaucracy that is instituted by a democratic regime, a state socialist regime, a communist regime, or a capitalist regime. He just didn't want there to be a bureaucracy at all. He thought people should have unmediated access to their own lives to live as they see fit, period.
Right. We should mention that, as a libertarian, bureaucracy for him meant really any kind of social democratic institutions. He was against, welfare, really any kind of charity. He believed that education, quote, ought to be equally divided between the family, which should lay the groundwork for the child's learning, and professionals who can pass on useful knowledge that the child's relatives might not have in their repertoire. So in other words, basically defund schools as much as we can, force parents to educate their kids, and only use actual teachers to fill the gaps. He said, today, the professional education establishment assumes the family doesn't know what its own members need or want. The result is a classic failure, an institutionalized system that does more harm than good. I gotta say, personally, I don't think you can compare American education in the 21st century with American education in the 18th century and say that, conclude that a home-based system has the best outcome for the most people. I think that's nonsense, but it's really interesting to see where this guy's, psychology led him.
Yeah, so as we've made abundantly clear, Paul is ultimately a false messiah for the Fremen. The everyday people see him as sort of a paragon of virtue, like King Arthur of Camelot, which, considering that this book was written by a Republican in 1963, tells you that there's a very particular inspiration there. That's right, John F. Kennedy.
Right. I had no idea, but apparently the inspiration for the anti-heroic, elements of Paul was, Jack Kennedy. And so here's, let's quote again from that Plowboy interview.
There's definitely an implicit warning in a lot of my work against big government, and especially against charismatic leaders. After all, such people, well-intentioned or not, are human beings who will make human mistakes. And what happens when someone is able to make mistakes for 200 million people? The errors are pretty damn big. For that reason, I think that John Kennedy is one of the most dangerous presidents this country ever had. People didn't question him, and whenever citizens are willing to give unwinged power to a charismatic leader, such as Kennedy, they tend to end up creating a kind of demigod, a leader who covers up mistakes instead of admitting them, and makes the matter worse instead of better. Now, Richard Nixon, on the other hand, did us all a favor.
You feel that Kennedy was dangerous and Nixon was good for the country?
Yes, Nixon taught us one hell of a lesson, and I thank him for it. He made us distrust government leaders. We don't mistrust Kennedy the same way we did Nixon, although we probably had as good reason to do so. But Nixon's downfall was due to the fact that he wasn't charismatic. He had to be sold just like the Wheaties, and people were disappointed when they opened the box. I think it's vital that men and women learn to mistrust all forms of powerful, centralized authority. Big government tends to create an enormous delay between the signals that come from the people and the response of the leaders. Put it this way, suppose there was a delay time of 5 minutes between the moment you turned the steering wheel on your car and the time the front tire reacted. What would happen in such a case?
I guess I'd have to drive pretty slowly.
Very slowly. Government has the same slow response effect. And the bigger the government, the more slowly it reacts. So to me, the best government is one that's very responsive to the needs of the people. That is the least, loosest, and most local government.
Yeah. And again, it's like, so this is a kind of classic right-wing libertarian attitude. Although I do think that his motivations here were, I guess, a little bit more selfless than you see for most libertarians. It was much less about having more freedom to accumulate wealth, which I think is what mostly drives libertarians, and more about this kind of genuine interest in what is the best for the most people. But his solutions, I think, are very, very strange. I don't really agree with most of them. But I do think that we should consider Dune part of the great, illustrious canon of crank fiction in America.
Yeah, absolutely. But I just really appreciate someone looking at JFK and saying, this is the most dangerous president we've ever had. Which, I mean, granted, this book was written during the Cuban Missile Crisis, basically, so it makes sense on one level. But, it's just very funny to think about because, again, this is just something that doesn't crop up in the popular consciousness these days.
Yeah, no, I agree. Although I think that, it's saying that if anything you say about Kennedy being too dangerous because he's too charismatic or whatever, I think that all goes down the toilet when you vote for Reagan. Like, come on, like who is Reagan if not the Republican Kennedy?
Well, Reagan was destroying government authorities, so Reagan good in the Herbert conception.
Exactly. Yeah. So to finish off here, you dug up this really cool piece by the MIT historian Megan Black, who wrote this long piece, a dissertation on the history of. It was really mostly about the proposals about off-planet outer space mining during the space race, something I didn't realize had been considered in the 60s and 70s. But she has a really interesting aside where she looks at the ways that science fiction authors dealt with this question, because fundamentally, the story of Dune is a story about space mining, because these, both the Harkonnens and the more heroic Atreides start these great industrial spice mining operations on the planet Arrakis, despite the protests of the local Fremen to enrich themselves and enrich the Galactic Empire. And she saw all of this, and really everything in the novel as a unique reflection of Frank Herbert's political world. Not just his political ideology, but his personal connections to political leaders like the Senator Guy Cordon he briefly worked for in the 50s. Because during that time with Cordon, Frank Herbert closely researched the possibilities of offshore oil drilling, which probably inspired, the industrial spice harvesting on Arrakis. And he paid close attention to the ways that the U.S. Department of Agriculture was kind of seeding desertified parts of the Northwest with local plants that could potentially thrive there. Megan Black writes the Department of Agriculture had effectively introduced biodiversity in a dune-filled landscape and turned them away from desolation. And I think that we can compare this really clearly to the ways that Paul Atreides promises to terraform Dune, to make the planet green. And then also I think that in the sequel, when Paul struggles to actually carry out this greenification policy, I think you can see a little bit of an echo of a frustrated libertarian employed by the federal government.
Yeah, so Megan Black, she's specifically a historian of the environmental management and mineral extraction history of the United States, so you can see why Dune is right up her alley. She writes that Herbert, quote, ultimately used the spice as a cipher for fossil fuels and petroleum in particular. The spice drives all the action, and Dune's climactic revolution ultimately functions to redress the ecological and colonialist injuries inflicted by its extraction.
Right. And, I'm not sure if he was thinking this when he was writing this at the time, but so much of the contemporary coverage about Dune connects spice extraction to the Middle Eastern oil industry and the ways that, the oil extraction in Iraq in particular has often been implicated in American imperialism.
Right. And yeah, there's definitely a lot of that in there. Continuing from Black, quote, like industrialized nations on Earth, the governments of Herbert's Dune universe destroyed the life system of another world from the comfortable distance of their biologically diverse homes. The lesson of Dune was clear. Humans must uphold biodiversity or face peril. Thus, Herbert dedicated the novel to the, quote, people whose labors go beyond the ideas of the realm of real materials, the ecologists. Dune's critiques helped to secure Herbert a prominent role in the environmental movement. As the ultimate signification of the Union, Herbert was invited to speak at the first Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970.
I think also one thing that I thought was very interesting that you points out is that one of the most important characters in the first half of the first Dune book is Liet Kynes. He is a planetologist. He also becomes Paul's posthumous father-in-law because he's the father of Chani. And he is a geologist, environmentalist, and anthropologist on the alien world of Arrakis. Although he is not himself a Fremen, he marries into this Fremen family and is kind of this almost like a John the Baptist figure for Paul. He is the first outsider who is adopted into the Fremen, and he helps Paul understand these strange desert people.
Yeah, from what I understand, when Herbert started writing Dune, he was going to center on Kynes in particular and talk about the ways that this scientist goes about interacting with his environment. But ultimately, his hate boner for Jack Kennedy just got too strong.
I think that we should all be grateful for that, because if we're talking about why Dune is a better book than Foundation, it's because if Isaac Asimov was writing this, it would have been the Liet Kynes book. He had the great idea to make it about this strange anti-hero instead. All right, but to bring this back to Megan Black, she points out that Liet Kynes is totally the moral center of the novel because he's really the only character whose motivations are truly noble, basically. And if we bring back the constant religious imagery in Dune, he tells Duke Leto Atreides, Paul's father, that Arrakis could be an Eden if the Empire could look up from grubbing for spice. And although this is only hinted at in the films, the books make it really clear that Arrakis is not naturally a desert. It is a man-made wasteland caused by 10,000 years of spice extraction. And so the Fremen, therefore, are survivors of a destroyed world. And the prophecy that Paul Muad'Dib will make the planet green will be the reclamation of their lost birthright. And so, if we bring this back to Herbert's relationship with Native Americans, with, Native Americans he was closely associated with, like his, friends Henry and Howie, settled characters in Dune, including the more heroic Atreides, they all describe the Fremen as barbarians. And we should mention that the guerrilla warfare tactics of the Fremen seem very much derived from Algerian revolutionaries and from figures like Geronimo. Herbert does not use the word terrorism, but the heroic Fremen are totally seen by their enemies as terrorists who commit the ultimate act of violence and destruction against their colonizers.
Right. So going back to Megan Black, quote, in idolizing this act, Herbert championed third world nationalist and indigenous resistance, which fought to defend sovereign rights over natural resources. Dune ultimately challenged the assumptions that increasingly drove NASA and the Interior Department to believe that the material potential of outer space It imagined a scenario in which the extension of human activity beyond the planet only propelled resource conflicts into new dimensions. The promise of extraterrestrial utopias further allowed humanity to continue modes of governance and social activity that were utterly unsustainable, those based on imperialist violence and ecological ruination. Dune ultimately used the planet Arrakis as a case study through which to discern the vital importance of adjusting collective behaviors in the present against the impulse to profligate expansion. It was a rare evaluation of the type of fantasies underscoring NASA's Interior Department experimentation in extraterrestrial resource development, in which space promised to help solve the resource problems of the Earth. Herbert, who closely followed reports from NASA in writing his novel, tapped into the types of questions galvanizing their projects. Would space exploration alleviate resource problems on Earth? Or, he asked, would it merely take the problems to new heights? Although Herbert's sequels, Dune Messiah and Children of Dune, would expand upon the mythology and show the perils of the exploited people's otherwise triumphant insurrection, the first novel is key in the way that it incisively illuminated the bind of space, that the move outward could merely repeat and intensify the disasters unfolding on Earth unless the sanctity of ecological diversity and sovereignty was taken to heart.
Right. And I think that is a great place to end on. Because, even though I think that I don't have very much in common with the politics of Frank Herbert, he absolutely had this, prophetic Muad'Dib vision of the ways that capitalism and all kinds of, human growth is going to eventually destroy us, turn our planet into the, desertified windswept landscape of Dune. And, unlike the characters in the film and the book, I don't think I personally am suited to be living in a still suit and recycling my own water.
Oh, yeah, that wouldn't be very fun at all. But, maybe that's where we're headed. Maybe the desertification efforts that are taking place across the country right now will ultimately prove successful, and that's just our lives from now on.
Yeah, I feel like we could honestly talk about Dune forever. There's just so much in this material. It's already been, over an hour. We should probably wrap up. But it's such an interesting work of fiction. There's a lot of interesting science fiction in it, and I haven't read as much as I should, but Dune was doing something so interesting so early that I think it really is deserving of a lot of attention. It kind of reminds me of Dracula, which we've spoken about a while back in this podcast, and that it's a work of entertainment that fits neatly in this, somewhat pulpy entertainment genre. But at the same time, there are a lot of really interesting ideas there. It gives you quite a lot to think about, and not just about the world and its characters and its implications, but also a lot to think about the author, because he is coming from this very specific and very unique intellectual standpoint that is, I would argue, so specific to his own idiosyncratic politics that it's very hard to imagine any Dune adaptation really getting the books right. But I think that so much of the story of Dune is so exciting and at times inspiring that I don't think you should hazard against trying to make adaptations. Famously, there was the 70s attempt by Jodorowsky that fell apart, that some people think could have been this, great accomplishment of global cinema. Other people think it would have been a disaster. Then you had the 80s version by David Lynch that didn't really take itself seriously at all. And then you have this version, which some have criticized for taking itself too seriously, and avoiding many of the kind of stranger, less expected, more genre deviant elements of the book. But I'm curious to see, what kind of legacy Dune is going to have in the future. If anyone's ever going to try to adapt it again, if the Islamic elements might come more to the forefront, or and also what's going to be the reaction of so many regular people really getting into such a strange book. I'm really curious to see what the reaction is once they put out Dune Messiah, because the sequels are where things really get weird.
Yeah, I am absolutely waiting to see how they are going to handle the whole worm god emperor thing, because I don't think our culture is ready for that at all, but it must be done.
No, yeah, Yeah, they already seem to be straying away from the weirder stuff. You know, like 'cause in the books, Paul is essentially a polygamist, married to, you know, his true wife, Chani, and then his, you know, loveless political marriage to Princess Irulan. They totally took that out of the book. I think that of the movie, that they thought that'd be too hard to explain to, you know, modern audiences. Yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff that we haven't seen yet that we're gonna see, and I'm really curious where this goes. All right. Well, Sam, thanks so much for putting this together. We could talk forever about Dune, but I think this is a good place to wrap up. I hope that maybe one day some kind of Paul Atreides figure can rise and, you know, stop the desertification of our own planet. I just hope that it doesn't come at the cost of 60 billion dead. And that's all I gotta say.
Yeah, well, fortunately, there is a Kennedy on the ballot this year, so if you're looking for a Paul Atreides, maybe that's the answer there.
Maybe that is how you get 60 billion dead, yeah. All right, well, thanks so much for putting this together, Mark and Sam. This was a really fun one, and I hope our listeners enjoyed.
All right, bye-bye.